Hi guys, here's a question. Have you ever looked up at the stars and felt like they were calling you, making you wonder what's really out there? For me, that feeling started not as something big and dramatic, but as a small, quiet thought under the night sky in Pisa. I followed my instincts, and it led me to discoveries that changed how people saw the whole universe. But not everyone was happy about what I found. They even tried to silence me. My name is Galileo Galilei, and I paid a heavy price for seeing what others refused to see. Listen closely as I recount how my discoveries changed both my life and our understanding of the universe. But before we jump into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're tuning in from, and which figure from Italy's fascinating history inspires you most. Share your thoughts in the comments, and perhaps their stories will be told in a future episode. Now that everything's settled, it's time to relax. Dim the lights. Let the world's noise fade, and come with me as we journey back through time. It began not with telescopes or complex calculations, but with simple observation. As a young man in Pisa, I would often walk to the harbour and watch the ships. There was something magical about seeing them gradually disappear over the horizon, the hull vanishing first, then the mast becoming a speck before fading entirely. This simple phenomenon whispered that our world was not quite what we had been taught. The curvature of the earth revealed itself in those disappearing ships, and I felt the first stirrings of curiosity about what other truths might be hidden in plain sight. My father intended for me to study medicine, a respectable profession that would provide security and status. I tried, truly I did. The University of Pisa offered the best education, and I attended lectures on anatomy and physiology. But while others marvelled at the intricacies of the human body, my mind kept wandering to different patterns. I found myself noticing the pendulum swing of the chapel lamp, timing its oscillations with my pulse. The mathematics of motion fascinated me far more than the memorization of bodily humours. The shift happened gradually, like the turning of the seasons. Mathematics spoke to me in a language more beautiful than any poetry. Where medicine dealt with the messy, unpredictable nature of human bodies, mathematics offered clean, elegant truths. 2 + 2 always equaled 4. The angles of a triangle always summed to 180 degrees. Here was a system that operated by consistent, measurable rules rather than tradition or authority. This was the quiet rebellion that began in my soul, the choice to trust observation over ancient texts. That first realization changed everything for me. The world was not a chaotic place governed by capricious forces, but a magnificent machine operating by knowable principles. I began to see patterns everywhere, in the way water flowed from a fountain, in the arc of a thrown ball, in the growth of plants towards sunlight. Each observation felt like uncovering a piece of a grand puzzle that God had left for us to solve. The more I looked, the more I understood that we'd been content with explanations that satisfied tradition rather than truth. The decision to abandon medicine for mathematics was not made lightly. My father was disappointed, and many friends thought me foolish for leaving a secure path. But I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that I was following my true calling. The poetry of numbers and the music of the spheres called to me more strongly than any practical consideration. I chose to trust what I could observe and measure rather than what I had been told to believe. This was the foundation upon which everything that followed would be built. The simple, radical idea that we should look at the world with fresh eyes rather than through the filter of ancient authority. The weight of Aristotle's authority pressed down on every classroom, every discussion, every thought about how the physical world operated. For nearly 2,000 years, his teachings had been accepted as absolute truth. Heavy objects fall faster than light ones. No one questioned this. No one even thought to test it. The idea was so deeply ingrained that professors would rather create complex explanations for why a feather falls slower than a stone than consider the possibility that Aristotle might be wrong. I found this blind acceptance troubling. If we claim to seek truth, how can we refuse to look at the world itself? The simple, elegant test formed in my mind during one of those endless philosophical debates. If Aristotle was correct, a 10-pound weight should fall 10 times faster than a 1-pound weight. The logic seemed flawless until you actually considered objects falling through air. I watched leaves flutter down beside falling acorns and noticed they didn't maintain perfect speed ratios. There was something more complex at work here, something that demanded actual observation rather than philosophical argument. So I decided to create a test that would remove all doubt. I chose the Leaning Tower not for drama, but for practicality. Its great height would allow enough time for any difference in falling speed to become apparent. On that clear morning, I climbed the stairs with 2 spheres, one 10 times heavier than the other. A small crowd had gathered below, mostly students and a few professors who had heard about my experiment. I could see the skepticism on their faces, the anticipation of seeing this young upstart proven wrong. Their faith in Aristotle was about to be tested against simple observation. The moment they struck the ground together remains etched in my memory. That single, unified thud that silenced the murmuring crowd. For a heartbeat, there was perfect stillness. Then came the confusion, the disbelief, the scrambling for explanations. Some claimed I must have tricked them. Others said the weights were too similar. But the truth was there in that single sound. 2 objects of different weights hitting the ground at exactly the same moment. Centuries of accepted wisdom had just been overturned by a simple experiment anyone could perform. The mixed reactions revealed more about human nature than about physics. Some students' eyes lit up with a thrill of discovery. They saw the beauty of a truth that had been waiting there all along. But the professors, the established scholars, reacted with anger and dismissal. They accused me of disrespecting tradition, of undermining authority, of dangerous thinking. One elderly scholar actually covered his ears when I tried to explain what we had just witnessed. That was when I understood that truth often meets resistance not because it's complex, but because it requires people to change what they believe. The rumours reached me in 1609 like fragments of a fantastic story. A Dutch spectacle maker had created a device that made distant objects appear miraculously close. They called it a spyglass, and merchants were using it to spot ships far out at sea. At first it seemed like little more than a curiosity, a clever toy for wealthy traders. But my mind immediately began working on the principles behind it. If this device could bring distant ships into view, what might it reveal if pointed upward toward the heavens? Possibility seized my imagination and refused to let go. I obtained a description of the basic design, a simple tube with lenses at both ends, and began the painstaking process of creating my own version. Night after night I worked by candlelight, grinding and polishing lenses until my hands ached and my eyes burned with fatigue. Each lens had to be perfectly curved, perfectly smooth, or the image would distort into useless blurriness. There were countless failures, lenses that cracked during polishing, combinations that produced nothing but foggy images, calculations that proved incorrect. But with each attempt, I learned something new about the behaviour of light and glass. The breakthrough came gradually rather than suddenly. I remember the night when I finally achieved threefold magnification. The campanile across the square appeared so close I could count the bricks, then sixfold, then eightfold. Each improvement felt like unlocking another door to understanding. But it wasn't until I reached ninefold magnification that I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of pointing my improved spyglass across the Venetian lagoon to spot ships, I turned it upward toward the moon on a clear autumn evening. What I saw that night stole the breath from my lungs. The moon, that perfect smooth sphere that poets and philosophers had described for centuries, was not smooth at all. Its surface was rugged and imperfect, marked by mountains that cast shadows and valleys that dipped into darkness. I could see craters and ridges, a landscape as varied and complex as our own Earth. This was not the perfect celestial body described by Aristotle and the Church Fathers. This was a world with topography and texture, and the realization shook me to my core. I began making detailed drawings of the lunar surface, tracking the changing shadows as the moon went through its phases. The more I observed, the more evidence I found that contradicted the accepted view of the heavens as perfect and unchanging. Here was direct visual proof that the celestial realm operated by the same physical principles as our earthly one. The implications were staggering. If the moon was a physical body like Earth, then perhaps Earth itself was not the unique centre of creation we had always believed it to be. The telescope became my window into truths that had been hidden from human eyes since the beginning of time. Night after night I would set up my instrument and gaze into the depths of space, each observation revealing new wonders. The excitement was tempered by a growing unease. I knew these discoveries would challenge centuries of doctrine and authority. But the evidence was there in the eyepiece, clear and undeniable. How could I deny what my own eyes showed me? How could anyone continue to believe the old stories when the truth was right there, waiting to be seen? It began with 4 small stars that shouldn't have been there. In January of 1610, while studying Jupiter through my improved telescope, I noticed 3 bright points of light aligned with the planet, 2 to the east, 1 to the west. They appeared fixed in relation to Jupiter, unlike the background stars that moved steadily westward as the night progressed. This alignment seemed unusual enough that I decided to track their positions night after night. What began as casual observation soon became the most thrilling investigation of my life. The next evening brought the first surprise. All 3 stars now stood to the west of Jupiter. This reversal of position made no sense if they were fixed stars. My curiosity turned to intense focus as I realized these were no ordinary stars. They moved, but their motion was tied to Jupiter itself. Night after night, I carefully sketched their positions relative to the planet, often working until my hands grew numb from the cold. The patterns that emerged defied all previous understanding of celestial motion. On January 13th, the mystery deepened when a 4th star appeared. Now there were 4 companions dancing around Jupiter, changing positions in ways that followed a beautiful, predictable pattern. They would disappear behind the planet, then reappear on the other side. Sometimes I would see only 2 or 3, depending on their orbital positions. The realization struck me with the force of revelation. These were not stars at all, but moons orbiting Jupiter, just as our moon orbits Earth. The implications were staggering. For centuries, we had been taught that everything in the heavens revolved around Earth. The Church Fathers, following Aristotle and Ptolemy, maintained that Earth stood motionless at the centre of creation, while all celestial bodies circled around us. Yet here was Jupiter, clearly moving through the sky with its own family of moons orbiting it. If Jupiter could have satellites that didn't circle Earth, then perhaps Earth wasn't the centre of everything after all. The evidence was right there in my telescope, night after night. I documented their movements with meticulous care, measuring their positions and timing their orbits. The 4 moons, which I would later name the Medicean stars in honour of my patrons, followed precise mathematical patterns. Their motions were orderly and predictable, governed by the same natural laws that operated here on Earth. This harmony between mathematics and observation filled me with awe. God had created a universe that could be understood through reason and measurement, not just through scripture and tradition. The excitement of discovery was tempered by a growing awareness of the controversy these observations would cause. I knew that claiming other worlds had their own satellites would challenge the entire cosmological system endorsed by the Church. Yet how could I deny what my own eyes showed me night after night? The evidence was too clear, too consistent to ignore. These 4 points of light circling Jupiter represented not just astronomical discovery, but a fundamental shift in how humanity understood its place in the universe. Each observation felt like uncovering another piece of a divine puzzle that had been waiting centuries for someone to look closely enough to see it. The dance of Venus became my next obsession after Jupiter's moons. Night after night, I tracked her movement across the sky, noting how her brightness changed in ways that made no sense under the old system. According to Ptolemy's Earth-centered model, Venus should always appear as a crescent since it never moved beyond the Sun from our perspective. Yet through my telescope I began to see something entirely different. Phases that mirrored our own moon's cycle. The first time I saw Venus as a perfect crescent, my hands trembled so badly I had to steady the telescope against the windowsill. This shouldn't be possible if Venus circled Earth. The only explanation was that Venus orbited the Sun, just as Copernicus had suggested decades earlier. As the weeks passed, I watched Venus grow from a thin crescent to a nearly full disk, then gradually shrink back again. The complete cycle of phases unfolded before my eyes, each observation strengthening the case for heliocentrism. The evidence became undeniable by the autumn of 1610. Venus showed phases exactly like our moon because it was reflecting sunlight while orbiting the Sun, not Earth. When Venus was on the far side of the Sun, it appeared full and small. As it moved between Earth and Sun, it showed a crescent shape and appeared larger because it was closer to us. This perfect correlation between apparent size and phase could only mean one thing. Copernicus had been right all along. The Earth moved around the Sun, not the other way around. The mixture of triumph and dread that filled me during those observations remains difficult to describe. On one hand, I felt the pure joy of discovery, the thrill of understanding a fundamental truth about our universe that had eluded humanity for centuries. The mathematical beauty of the system revealed itself in the perfect correlation between prediction and observation. Yet alongside this excitement grew a cold knot of apprehension in my stomach. I knew what this meant for the established order, for the Church's teachings, for my own safety. I documented every observation with meticulous care, making detailed sketches of Venus's changing appearance. The evidence mounted with each passing week, building an incontrovertible case that would force a re-evaluation of humanity's place in the cosmos. Yet I found myself hesitating to share these findings immediately. The Jupiter moons had caused enough controversy. This discovery would shake the very foundations of accepted cosmology. I needed to present the evidence in a way that would allow people to see the truth for themselves rather than feeling attacked in their beliefs. The winter of 1610 to 1611 brought the most compelling evidence yet. Venus reached its greatest elongation, its farthest point from the Sun as seen from Earth, and showed a perfect half phase. This moment, predicted by Copernican calculations, matched my observations exactly. There was no room for doubt anymore. The Earth moved around the Sun and Venus did the same. The universe operated according to mathematical principles that could be discovered through observation and reason, not just through ancient texts and tradition. As I prepared to share these findings, I understood that I was stepping into dangerous territory. The Church had tolerated my lunar observations and even shown interest in Jupiter's moons. But claiming that Earth was not the centre of creation, that was heresy, according to the Council of Trent. Yet how could I deny what the evidence so clearly showed? The phases of Venus spoke a truth that transcended human doctrine. They revealed a universe far more magnificent and orderly than we had ever imagined, and that truth deserved to be seen, even if seeing came at great personal cost. The decision to publish my findings came with both excitement and trepidation. I knew these celestial discoveries demanded careful presentation, not as wild speculation, but as documented observations anyone could verify with their own telescope. Each word in Sidereus Nuncius, the starry messenger, was chosen with precision. I described the lunar mountains with measured detail, the Medicean stars with exact orbital periods, all while letting the evidence speak for itself. The challenge was to present revolutionary ideas without appearing revolutionary, to show rather than tell the new cosmology taking shape before our eyes. Dedicating Jupiter's moons to the Medici family was both genuine admiration and necessary protection. The 4 stars circling Jupiter represented a new system, and naming them after Cosimo II and his 3 brothers created a powerful connection between earthly power and celestial discovery. This patronage offered a shield against the inevitable criticism, linking my work to the most powerful family in Tuscany. The dedication acknowledged their support while subtly suggesting that just as these moons orbited Jupiter, so did Florence orbit the enlightened leadership of the Medici. The manuscript's publication in March 1610 created an immediate sensation across Europe's intellectual circles. Scholars who could read Latin devoured the descriptions of a rugged moon and Jupiter's companions. Letters began arriving from across the continent, some expressing awe and excitement, others demanding proof or challenging my methods. The telescope itself became an object of fascination, with noblemen and scholars suddenly desperate to obtain one of these Galilean instruments to see the heavens for themselves. For the first time, humanity had tools to extend vision beyond earthly limitations, but alongside the admiration came the first whispers of concern from church authorities. Some theologians argued that if the moon was imperfect, it challenged the doctrine of celestial perfection. If Jupiter had moons, it complicated the simple geocentric model. The very success of the starry messenger created unease in certain quarters. My careful phrasing about saving the appearances while presenting evidence couldn't prevent the growing tension between observed reality and accepted doctrine. The telescope had become both window to truth and instrument of controversy. The formal declaration arrived on a Tuesday morning, brought by a solemn-faced messenger from Rome. The congregation of the Index had examined the matter of heliocentrism and found it formally heretical because it contradicted Scripture. Those words struck me with physical force, as if the very air had been punched from my lungs. For years, I had operated under the assumption that truth could not contradict truth, that God's word and God's works must ultimately agree. Now the highest authorities were declaring that my observations conflicted with divine revelation, and the implications were terrifying. Cardinal Bellarmine himself delivered the official admonition. We met in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the faint scent of incense. His manner was not unkind. He spoke gently, almost regretfully, as he explained the Church's position. I was not to hold or defend the opinion that the Earth moves around the Sun. I could discuss it as a mathematical hypothesis, a convenient calculating tool but not as physical reality. The distinction felt both arbitrary and dangerous. How could I teach something as mathematically sound yet physically false? How could the universe operate one way for calculation and another in reality? The internal conflict that followed nearly tore me apart. On one hand, my faith in the church ran deep. I believed in its authority and its role as guardian of truth. On the other hand, the evidence of my eyes and instruments showed a different story. Night after night, I would return to my telescope and see Venus's phases, Jupiter's moons, the moon's mountains, all testifying to a system that made perfect mathematical sense. The difference between obedience and observation created a constant tension in my mind and spirit. I made the decision to bide my time while continuing my work. The prohibition against teaching heliocentrism as truth did not forbid further observation or private speculation. I would continue gathering evidence, refining my calculations, corresponding with other thinkers across Europe. Perhaps in time, with more evidence, the Church would see that scripture and science could be reconciled. Perhaps the problem was not in the discoveries themselves, but in how we interpreted both the Bible and the Book of Nature. This middle path felt like walking a knife's edge, remaining obedient while preserving the integrity of my work. The years that followed were marked by careful phrasing and measured silence in public forums. In private correspondence and unpublished writings, I continued to develop the evidence for heliocentrism. I studied sunspots, tracked planetary motions, refined telescope designs. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, building a case that grew stronger with every observation. The tension between what I knew and what I could say publicly created a constant undercurrent of frustration, but I believed time and evidence would eventually resolve the conflict in favour of truth. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the quiet work of observation. Under the Medici's protection in Florence, I continued my studies, though now with a new awareness of watching eyes. My workshop became both sanctuary and prison, a place where I could pursue truth while knowing that every discovery might be used against me. The telescope remained my window to the heavens, but now I measured my words as carefully as I measured the movements of celestial bodies. Each observation was recorded in private notebooks, the evidence accumulating like treasures too dangerous to display. The growing body of evidence created its own kind of tension. Sunspots moving across the solar surface proved the sun itself rotated, another blow to the idea of perfect, unchanging heavens. The moons of Jupiter continued their precise dances, their orbits following mathematical laws that spoke of an orderly universe. Venus completed its phases with clockwork regularity, each cycle confirming the heliocentric model. Yet I could share none of this as physical truth, only as mathematical curiosity, as hypothetical models. The distance between what I knew and what I could say stretched wider with each passing month. Correspondence became my lifeline to the wider world of learning. Letters travelled secretly to and from thinkers across Europe. Kepler in Prague, mathematicians in France, astronomers in England. We wrote in careful codes, discussing discoveries while avoiding direct challenge to church doctrine. These letters were like candles burning in distant windows, each one proof that the pursuit of truth continued despite restrictions. The international community of natural philosophers recognized what was at stake, not just astronomy, but the very method of seeking knowledge through observation and reason. The constant tension between truth and obedience wore on me in subtle ways. I found myself hesitating before speaking, weighing each word for possible misinterpretation. Public lectures became exercises in careful phrasing, discussing the mathematics of motion without mentioning their implications for cosmology. Even private conversations with trusted colleagues carried an edge of caution, This self-censorship felt like wearing clothing that never quite fit properly, always aware of the constraints, always measuring the distance between what I wanted to say and what was safe to express. Yet the work continued because it had to. The stars knew nothing of our earthly disputes. The planets continued their motions regardless of our understanding. Each clear night found me at the telescope, adding another observation, another measurement to the growing evidence. There was comfort in this constancy. The heavens operated by rules that transcended human authority, and in their silent motion I found a truth that needed no defence. The patience of the stars became my model. They had waited centuries to be properly understood, and I could wait a little longer for the world to catch up to what they had been showing us all along. The concept took form slowly, like a mountain emerging from morning mist. I envisioned a discussion between three characters, a clever Florentine, a Venetian scholar, and a simple-minded traditionalist who would represent the old ways. The beauty of this approach was its fairness. I could present both systems through dialogue, allowing readers to judge for themselves which arguments held weight. The characters would speak in everyday language, making complex ideas accessible to any educated person willing to listen with an open mind. My hope was that reason would prevail through civil discussion rather than confrontation. If I could show how the evidence pointed clearly to heliocentrism, while respectfully addressing counter-arguments, perhaps the Church would see that this was not heresy, but honest inquiry. The dialogue format allowed me to present the Copernican system as the more elegant explanation while maintaining the fiction that I was merely discussing hypotheses. Each argument was carefully crafted to lead the reader toward truth without explicitly stating conclusions. The balancing act required exquisite care. I had to present enough evidence to be convincing while avoiding direct challenge to church authority. The character of Salviati would voice the Copernican arguments, Sagredo would play the intelligent neutral observer, and Simplicio would defend the Ptolemaic system with increasingly weak arguments. The structure felt natural, a genuine exploration of ideas rather than a polemic. I wrote during the quiet hours, imagining these three men conversing in a Venetian palace, their discussion unfolding over 4 days of thoughtful exchange. The character of Simplicio became my greatest concern. I intended him to represent the Aristotelian position faithfully, but his arguments needed to be weak enough that readers would naturally side with Salviati. Unfortunately, I made him slightly too simple-minded, his defences of tradition occasionally bordering on foolishness. I didn't anticipate how personally some would take this characterization, least of all the Pope himself, who had initially encouraged my work but might see Simplicio as a caricature of his own positions. The unintended offence would become the crack through which all my careful planning would unravel. The book appeared in Florence in the spring of 1632, and for a few precious weeks everything felt possible again. The dialogue concerning the two chief world systems reached scholars and thinkers across Italy, and the initial responses filled me with hope. Letters arrived praising the clarity of the arguments, the elegance of the explanations. Even those who disagreed with the conclusions acknowledged the power of the evidence presented. In those first days, I dared to believe that reason might triumph, that the careful presentation of facts might overcome generations of tradition. The dream of a world where observation mattered more than authority seemed within reach. Then the silence began. The letters slowed, then stopped altogether. Friends in Rome wrote cautious notes suggesting I might have gone too far. The book that had been celebrated in Florence was being read very differently in the Holy City. The problem, it seemed, was not what I had written, but how it had been received by one reader in particular. Pope Urban VIII, who had once encouraged my work and even discussed these ideas with me, saw something in the dialogue that I never intended: personal mockery. The character of Simplicio, meant to represent the Aristotelian position, became the focal point of the growing storm. Though I had based his arguments on actual traditional views, his simple-minded defences of the old system struck some readers as caricature. Worst of all, I had placed the Pope's own favourite argument, that God could have arranged the heavens in any way, making human observation irrelevant, in Simplicio's mouth at the very end of the book. What I intended as respectful inclusion of the papal viewpoint was interpreted as deliberate insult. The shift from celebrated thinker to suspected heretic happened with terrifying speed. By summer, the book was being examined by the Congregation of the Index. By autumn, the Inquisition had taken notice. The very patronage that had protected me for years suddenly felt like a fragile shield against a gathering storm. Friends who had praised the book now avoided my company. The same Medici court that had celebrated my discoveries grew quiet and distant. The air itself seemed to change, filled with unspoken accusations and fear. The summons to Rome arrived on a cold morning in September. It was not an invitation but a command. I was to present myself before the Holy Office to answer questions about the dialogue. The document was formal, precise, and utterly terrifying. At 68 years old, in failing health, I was being ordered to make the difficult winter journey to Rome to defend myself against charges that could mean imprisonment or worse. The world I'd carefully built through decades of work was crumbling around me, and all because I had tried to show people what the stars themselves had revealed. The journey began in the bitter cold of February, a time when sensible men stay by their fires. At 68 years old, my body already protested the simplest movements, the arthritis in my hands, the ache in my joints that predicted rain better than any barometer. The road to Rome stretched before me like a penance, each mile a reminder of how far I had fallen from favour. The carriage jolted and rattled over frozen ruts, each bounce sending pain through my stiffened limbs. I wrapped my cloak tighter against the damp cold that seeped through the carriage walls, feeling every one of my years in the relentless discomfort of travel. The landscape passed in a grey monotony. Bare vineyards, sleeping villages, mist-shrouded hills. My mind kept returning to previous journeys to Rome under happier circumstances. I remembered arriving in triumph after publishing the Starry Messenger, welcomed by cardinals and scholars, eager to see the celestial wonders through my telescope. Those visits had been filled with lively debates, intellectual excitement, and the warmth of collegial respect. Now I travelled as an accused man, summoned not as an honoured guest, but as a defendant facing the most powerful judicial body in Christendom. The weight of what awaited me grew heavier with each passing mile. The Holy Office of the Inquisition did not issue casual invitations. Their summons meant serious charges, formal proceedings, and the very real possibility of severe punishment. I tried to prepare my defence, rehearsing arguments in my mind, but the constant jostling of the carriage and the gnawing anxiety made concentration difficult. How does one defend seeing? How does one argue against evidence that exists in the very heavens themselves? The physical discomfort became a constant companion. Cold nights in draughty inns, miserable food, the endless rocking motion that left me perpetually weary. My assistant, who accompanied me out of loyalty, tried to keep my spirits up with conversation about mathematics or astronomy, but even these familiar comforts felt distant and abstract. The reality of my situation kept intruding. I was travelling toward confrontation with an institution that had the power to destroy not just my work, but my very life. The Apennine Mountains presented the greatest challenge. Steep, winding roads made treacherous by winter weather. Our carriage slipped on icy patches, the horses straining against the grade. At one particularly difficult pass, we had to disembark and walk behind the carriage as the driver urged the horses forward. The cold air burned my lungs, and I found myself leaning heavily on my walking stick, each step a small agony. In that moment, surrounded by majestic peaks under a leaden sky, I felt both the insignificance of one man against such power and the strange comfort of nature's indifference to human struggles. As we descended toward the Tiber Valley, the first signs of spring appeared. Patches of green grass, early blossoms on almond trees. The contrast between the renewing world and my own deteriorating situation felt particularly cruel. Farmers were preparing their fields for planting. Children played in village squares. Life continued its normal rhythms while mine was being pulled towards some terrible conclusion. The ordinary beauty of the countryside seemed to mock my extraordinary circumstances. The approach to Rome brought no comfort. Seeing the familiar skyline, the dome of St. Peter's, the ancient walls, filled me not with the usual excitement of returning to a city I loved, but with dread. This was where I would face judgment for daring to look upward, for trusting my eyes and instruments, for believing that God's creation could be understood through observation and reason. The carriage wheels clattered over the cobblestones, each turn bringing me closer to my destination, each heartbeat measuring the time I had left as a free man. The city itself seemed different. The same buildings, the same streets, but now viewed through the lens of impending judgment. People went about their business unaware of the old man in the passing carriage who had seen further than any human before him and was now being punished for it. We arrived at the Villa Medici, where I would stay as a guest of the Tuscan ambassador, though guest felt like too generous a term for someone under virtual house arrest awaiting trial. The gates closed behind us, and I knew my world had suddenly become much smaller, bounded by walls and watched by careful eyes. The room they brought me to was smaller than I expected, with high windows that let in thin slices of the afternoon light. There was a simple table, 2 chairs, and the distinct smell of old paper and beeswax. The Inquisitor sat across from me, his face a mask of careful neutrality. He had my book open on the table between us, certain passages marked with small slips of paper. His first question was deceptively simple. Did you obtain proper permission to publish this work? I explained that I had received the necessary imprimatur from the Florentine censors, that every proper channel had been followed. But I knew this was merely the opening move in a much larger game. The charges were read in a calm, measured voice that made them sound even more serious. They accused me of violating the 1616 injunction against teaching Copernicanism, of presenting heliocentrism as physical truth rather than mathematical hypothesis, of showing disrespect for church authority through the character of Simplicio. Each accusation felt like a stone added to a growing weight on my chest. I tried to explain that the dialogue presented both systems, that I had carefully framed the arguments as discussion rather than declaration, but the Inquisitor's questions kept returning to the same point. Did I believe the earth moves around the sun? The careful parsing of my words from years earlier began. Letters I'd written to colleagues, casual remarks made in conversations, even private notes were produced as evidence. They'd been collecting these fragments for years, it seemed, building a case while I continued my work unaware. Each phrase was examined for hidden meaning, each argument analysed for possible heresy. I found myself in the strange position of having to explain my own thoughts as if they belonged to someone else, to distance myself from conclusions that felt as natural as breathing. When the demand to recant came, it was not shouted but stated quietly, as if reminding me of something I'd simply forgotten. You must acknowledge that the earth stands motionless at the centre of creation, the Inquisitor said. You must reject the false opinion that it moves around the sun. The words hung in the air between us. How does one deny what one has seen with one's own eyes? How does one reject evidence that appears in the regular phases of Venus, the orbits of Jupiter's moons, the mathematics that so beautifully predicts their motions? The threat of torture was never spoken aloud, but it permeated the room like cold air seeping under the door. I was an old man, already suffering from arthritis and other ailments. The instruments of persuasion they employed in the dungeons below could easily break what little health remained to me. Yet the greater fear was not physical pain, but the spiritual crisis of denying truth. If I recanted, would I be betraying not just science, but God himself, the God who had created this magnificent, orderly universe that operated by knowable laws? I asked for time to consider my position, to consult with friends and perhaps negotiate some middle ground. The Inquisitor agreed, but his manner suggested this was merely a formality. The outcome had already been decided. As I was escorted back to my rooms at the Villa Medici, the weight of that unspoken threat followed me. The stars I had studied for decades seemed very far away indeed, their silent truth suddenly costly beyond measure. The evidence that had filled me with wonder now felt like evidence against my own soul. The days settled into a strange rhythm of confinement and uncertainty. Though I remained at the Villa Medici as a guest of the Tuscan ambassador, the reality was house arrest in everything but name. Guards stood at the gates, not to keep people out but to ensure I didn't leave. The elegant rooms that had once hosted celebrations and intellectual gatherings now felt like gilded cages. Each morning I would rise and look out at the same courtyard, the same slice of Roman sky, wondering when the next summons would come. Time stretched and contracted in odd ways, hours dragging while awaiting news, then days vanishing in anxious contemplation. Letters became my fragile connection to the world beyond those walls. Supporters across Europe wrote cautiously worded messages of encouragement, their phrases carefully crafted to avoid causing further trouble. Kepler wrote from Prague, his words a mixture of scientific solidarity and genuine concern for my safety. Even Cardinal Barberini, once a friend and supporter, sent discreet notes suggesting compromise. These letters were like birds flying into my confinement, each one bringing news of a world that continued to turn while my own life had stalled. I would read them by the window, watching the sunlight move across the page, measuring time by the changing angle of light. The growing certainty of the verdict took root in my mind like a persistent weed. Each day without news only reinforced what I already knew in my bones. The outcome had been decided before I ever reached Rome. The trial itself would be theatre, a performance of justice rather than its actual execution. My role was to play the repentant heretic, to provide the church with a public victory that would reinforce its authority. The evidence, the arguments, the truth of what I had seen, none of it would matter in that courtroom. The real trial had already happened in the minds of those who saw new ideas as threats to be controlled, rather than truths to be embraced. I spent those weeks preparing myself mentally for what was to come. There were moments of anger, frustration that truth should bow to power, that observation should yield to doctrine. But more often, there was a strange calm that settled over me. I had lived 68 years, most of them dedicated to understanding God's creation through the tools he gave us: reason, observation, mathematics. If my punishment was to deny what I knew to be true, then the loss would be not mine, but theirs. The stars would continue their motions regardless of what any tribunal declared, and that thought brought a peculiar kind of peace. The hall was larger than I expected, with high vaulted ceilings that made our voices echo strangely. They sat me at a small wooden table facing the cardinals, their red robes like splashes of blood against the dark panelling. The proceedings began with a reading of the charges, the same accusations from the interrogation, now formalized into legal language that made them sound even more serious. vehemently suspect of heresy, echoed through the chamber, each word landing with the weight of centuries of authority. I tried to follow the arguments, but my mind kept returning to the evidence, the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, the mathematics that so beautifully predicted their motions. How could heresy feel so much like truth? They presented their evidence with meticulous care, pages from the dialogue, letters I had written, testimony from witnesses I had never met. Each piece was meant to build the case that I had knowingly violated the 1616 injunction. I listened as my own words were read back to me, stripped of context and intention. The character of Simplicio, meant to represent Aristotelian views, was portrayed as a deliberate mockery of the Pope himself. My attempts to present both systems fairly were interpreted as clever deception. The more they spoke, the more I understood that this was not about astronomy, but about authority, who had the right to interpret God's creation. When my turn came to speak, my voice sounded thin and old in that vast space. I explained that the dialogue presented arguments, not conclusions, that I had followed the proper forms by obtaining imprimatur, that I had framed the Copernican system as hypothesis rather than doctrine. But the cardinals' faces remained impassive. They had not come to be convinced by evidence, but to deliver a verdict already decided. The truth of the heavens mattered less than the perception of challenged church authority. I found myself speaking more to the future than to the men in that room, hoping that someday someone would understand what this moment truly represented. The moment of declaration came on June 22nd. I stood before them, my body trembling not from fear but from exhaustion and arthritis. The words vehemently suspect of heresy hung in the air between us. Then came the choice they offered, recantation or execution. The simplicity of it stunned me. After a lifetime of observing complexity and nuance in the universe, they reduced truth to a binary choice. Deny what you know or die. I looked at their faces, men of God who believed they were protecting truth, and understood that we served different masters. They served an institution. I served evidence. I thought of the thousands of hours spent at my telescope, the careful recordings of planetary motions, the mathematical proofs that sang with divine order. I thought of students across Europe who were building on this work, of the future that awaited if truth could be pursued freely. And I thought of my daughter Maria Celeste, whose letters gave me strength even now. The choice became clear, though it broke something inside me. I would speak the words they demanded, but the truth would remain in my heart, in my work, in the silent motion of the stars that continued regardless of human declarations. The document they placed before me contained the recantation they had prepared. I read the words denying that the earth moves around the sun, affirming that it stands motionless at the center of creation. My hand shook as I took the quill, the arthritis making the movement painful. The scratch of pen on parchment sounded unnaturally loud in the silent hall. As I signed my name, I felt not just the weight of the moment, but the weight of centuries of suppressed inquiry. The legend that I muttered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, is fiction, but the sentiment was true. My voice might deny, but the universe would continue its silent testimony. The words tasted like ash in my mouth as I spoke them. I, Galileo Galilei, abjure, curse, and attest the aforesaid errors and heresies. Each phrase felt like a betrayal of everything I had spent my life discovering. The hall was utterly silent except for my trembling voice and the occasional rustle of robes as the cardinals watched. I denied that the sun is the centre of the universe and motionless. I denied that the earth is not the centre and moves. I rejected the entire Copernican system that my own eyes had shown me to be true. The irony was crushing. Here I stood, using the gift of speech God gave me to deny the truth he had written in the heavens. The physical sensation of signing the document remains etched in my memory. The rough texture of the parchment, the way the quill scratched against the surface, the slight tremor in my hand that made the signature look like that of an old, broken man. Perhaps that was appropriate. The ink seemed darker than usual, as if absorbing the darkness of the moment itself. As I set down the quill, I felt a strange detachment, as if watching someone else perform this terrible pantomime of surrender. The Galileo who had climbed the Leaning Tower, who had first seen Jupiter's moons, who had charted Venus's phases, that man would never have put his name to such falsehoods. The hollow feeling that followed was worse than any physical pain they could have inflicted. As I affirmed that Earth stands motionless at the centre of creation, my mind showed me the evidence that proved otherwise, the precise mathematics of planetary motion, the clear phases of Venus, the orderly dance of Jupiter's moons. The disconnect between the words I spoke and the truth I knew created a fracture within me that I feared might never heal. I was denying not just science, but the very method of seeking truth through observation and reason that had been my life's work. The legend that I muttered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, as I rose from my knees, is a story others created to comfort themselves. The truth is, I said nothing. What would have been the point? The men in that room were not interested in what actually moved or stood still. They were interested in obedience. The real rebellion was not in whispered defiance, but in the evidence itself, which would continue to speak truth long after all of us in that room were dust. The stars would continue their silent motion regardless of what any document declared, and that knowledge was the only comfort I allowed myself in that moment of public humiliation. The journey back to Florence felt longer than the one to Rome, though the distance remained the same. Each mile carried the weight of my new reality. I was returning not as a free man, but as a prisoner of my own home. The guards who accompanied me were not protectors but jailers, their presence a constant reminder that my world had shrunk to the dimensions of my villa and its gardens. When we arrived, the familiar rooms felt different, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the verdict from Rome. The books, the instruments, the unfinished manuscripts all remained where I had left them, but now viewed through the lens of permanent confinement. The restrictions settled around me like a heavy cloak. No visitors without permission from the Holy Office, no travel beyond the property boundaries. All correspondence must be reviewed before sending or receiving. Even my telescope, once my window to the universe, now felt like evidence in a case against me. I would walk through my gardens, tracing the same paths day after day, the high walls a physical representation of the constraints on my mind and spirit. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent my life studying the boundless heavens, only to be confined to a few acres of earth. Yet within these walls small comforts remained. My daughter Maria Celeste, now Sister Maria Celeste at the convent in Arcetri, wrote letters that became my connection to warmth and normalcy. Her faith never wavered, her belief in me unshaken by the official condemnation. She would send simple gifts, preserved fruits from the convent garden, a new blanket for the winter chill, prayers copied in her careful handwriting. These small tokens reminded me that love could cross even the most carefully guarded boundaries. Her confinement in the convent mirrored my own in strange ways, yet her spirit remained free in ways mine struggled to be. The rhythm of days established itself slowly. Mornings for correspondence and reading, afternoons for walking in the garden when weather permitted, evenings for quiet contemplation. I continued my work where possible, shifting from astronomy to the study of motion and mechanics, subjects less likely to attract further attention. There was a strange peace in this smaller focus, in problems that could be solved with mathematics rather than contested with authorities. The satisfaction of a well-proven theorem, the elegance of mathematical demonstration, these became my small victories against the larger defeat I had suffered in Rome. The work continued because it had to, because the questions themselves refused to be imprisoned. My confinement narrowed the physical world to these rooms and gardens, but the mind knows no such boundaries. I turned from the heavens I could no longer properly observe to the physics of motion here on earth, the fall of objects, the swing of pendulums, the mathematics of acceleration. There was a certain peace in studying what could be measured without controversy, in problems that yielded to mathematics rather than dogma. The satisfaction of a well-proven theorem became my small daily victory against the larger defeat. The shift to studying motion and mechanics felt like returning to my first love, the clean elegance of mathematics applied to physical reality. I set up simple experiments with inclined planes, measuring how objects accelerated down slopes, timing their descent with the pulse beats I'd used since my student days. The precision of mathematics offered a refuge from the messy contradictions of human authority. Here, in the behaviour of rolling balls and swinging weights, I found consistency and order that no tribunal could overturn. The laws of motion operated regardless of what any church declared, and that constancy became my comfort. Writing the two new sciences became my primary occupation during those confined years. The manuscript took shape slowly, a conversation between the same three characters from my dialogue, but now discussing physics rather than astronomy. There was safety in this subject. Motion and mechanics concerned earthly matters that drew less theological scrutiny. Yet the implications were profound, laying groundwork for understanding the very forces that governed celestial motions as well. I worked carefully, knowing this might be my final contribution, my last opportunity to share what I had learned about how God's creation actually operated. The failing eyesight that had begun before my trial worsened steadily in confinement. The world gradually dimmed, colours fading to shades of grey, details blurring into indistinct shapes. The irony was cruel, but not lost on me. The man who had seen further than any human before him was going blind from staring at the sun through his telescope. I learned to work through assistants, dictating equations, describing diagrams, relying on their eyes to continue the work mine could no longer perform. The internal vision grew sharper, even as external sight faded. The mathematics clear in my mind even when the page before me was a blur. The correspondence continued despite restrictions, though now filtered through the watchful eyes of the Holy Office. Letters arrived from thinkers across Europe, some offering sympathy, others seeking guidance on mathematical problems, a few daring to discuss astronomical matters in carefully coded language. These connections became threads tying me to the wider world of learning that continued beyond my walls. I took particular satisfaction in encouraging younger scientists, offering suggestions on their work, knowing that the pursuit of truth would continue through them, even if I could no longer participate directly. The role of my daughter, Maria Celeste, became increasingly important during these years. Her letters arrived regularly, filled with news of the convent, gentle encouragement, and unwavering faith in both God and my work. She would copy out passages from Scripture that spoke of God's glory in creation, seeing no contradiction between faith and science. Her own confinement in the convent mirrored mine in strange ways, yet she found freedom in devotion, where I sought it in understanding. Her belief that truth ultimately harmonized with faith became a quiet anchor in my increasingly isolated world. The scientific legacy taking shape beyond my walls brought both satisfaction and frustration. Through correspondence, I learned of others building on my work, refining telescope designs, improving mathematical methods, confirming observations I had made years earlier. There was comfort in knowing the work continued, that truth would eventually prevail through accumulated evidence. Yet there was also pain in being sidelined, in watching from confinement as others explored the heavens I could no longer properly see. The satisfaction of being proven right warred with the frustration of being prevented from contributing further. The distinction between scripture and nature as God's works remained clear in my mind despite everything. I never saw conflict between faith and science, only between human interpretations of scripture and human observations of nature. God had given us both the Bible and the natural world, and truth could not contradict truth. The sadness came from institutions that feared new understanding, that saw inquiry as threat rather than celebration of God's magnificent creation. This belief sustained me through the darkest moments, the conviction that I served God by seeking to understand His works. The nature of truth itself became my constant meditation during those confined years. There is a difference between being told something and discovering it for yourself, between accepting authority and understanding through evidence. The weight of measured observation carries a certainty that the weight of tradition cannot match. The personal cost of seeing differently had been high, but the quiet certainty that persisted despite opposition made the cost bearable. Truth has a way of enduring long after its discoverers are gone, and that thought brought peace as the world continued its motions without me. The world began to dim gradually, as if someone were slowly turning down a lamp wick. It started with the stars. Those familiar points of light that had been my companions for decades began to lose their sharpness, their edges blurring into soft halos. Then the pages of my books, once so clear, required holding farther from my face, then squinting, then finally relying on others to read them aloud. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had seen further than any human before him was going blind from the very act of seeing. Those years of staring at the sun through my telescope, mapping sunspots and tracking transits, had exacted their price on my vision. The process was mercifully slow, giving me time to adapt. I learned to recognize the shapes of my instruments by touch, the cool brass of the telescope tube, the smooth glass of lens surfaces, the precise gears of the measuring devices. My hands became my eyes in the workshop, fingers tracing equations on paper I could no longer read clearly. The mathematics remained sharp in my mind even when the ink on the page blurred into grey smudges. There was a strange comfort in this. The internal vision of numbers and relationships remained clear even as the external world faded. The greatest loss was the night sky. I would still go into the garden on clear evenings, tilting my face toward where I knew the constellations to be. Jupiter would be somewhere in the south at this time of year, Venus setting in the west. I could picture their positions, their movements, as clearly as if I still saw them. But now it was memory rather than observation, the ghost of sight rather than sight itself. My assistants would describe what they saw through the telescope, but their words were poor substitutes for direct vision. They saw patterns. I had seen relationships. They saw points of light. I had seen a system. The irony of going blind from studying the sun stayed with me. I had been so careful in my observations, using smoked glass and limited exposure, but the damage accumulated over thousands of hours of study. Some said it was divine punishment for looking where man shouldn't look, but I knew better. It was simply the cost of curiosity, the price paid for extending human vision beyond its natural limits. If given the choice, I would have paid it again. Better to have seen what I saw and lost my sight than to have kept my vision and remained ignorant. I grew increasingly dependent on my assistants and my daughter for correspondence. They became my eyes, reading letters from across Europe, describing diagrams and illustrations, transcribing my dictated responses. There was frustration in this dependence, the delay between thought and expression, the need to trust others with precise mathematical notation. But there was also a new kind of clarity that emerged. Freed from the distraction of visual details, the essential patterns and relationships stood out more sharply in my mind. The music of the spheres became purer when heard rather than seen. Maria Celeste's letters became my anchor in the fading light. Her careful handwriting, which I could still barely make out by bringing the page close to my face, described the world beyond my walls with loving detail. She would tell me about the olive harvest at the convent, the quality of the light at different times of day, the patterns of birds migrating south for winter. Her descriptions were so vivid that I could almost see through her eyes. Her own confinement in the convent mirrored my physical limitations, yet her spirit remained free and observant, and she generously shared that vision with me. The internal vision that grew as external sight faded became my greatest comfort. With eyes closed, I could still see the moon's mountains casting sharp shadows, Jupiter's moons in their precise orbits, Venus moving through her phases. These images, built from thousands of hours of observation, remained sharper than anything my failing eyes could still perceive. The mathematics behind these motions played in my mind like music, elegant equations describing relationships that were true whether anyone observed them or not. This was the ultimate truth I had discovered, that the universe operated by knowable laws, and sight was only one way to apprehend them. The letters became my secret lifeline to the world beyond these walls, each one carefully composed and discreetly delivered. Though the Holy Office reviewed all my correspondence, we developed subtle ways to communicate what mattered most. A discussion of planetary mathematics could contain hidden references to orbital mechanics. A request for technical advice might conceal shared excitement about new discoveries. These letters travelled across Europe like quiet conspirators, carrying fragments of truth past watchful eyes. Each envelope that arrived felt like a small victory against the isolation they had imposed on me. Johannes Kepler in Prague remained my most consistent correspondent, his letters filled with both scientific insight and personal warmth. We discussed everything from the mathematics of elliptical orbits to the challenges of raising children, though his words always returned to the same theme. Truth cannot be imprisoned forever. His own mother had faced witchcraft accusations for supporting his work, so he understood the personal cost of seeing differently. His letters often included mathematical puzzles or observations that kept my mind sharp despite my confinement. Through him, I stayed connected to the vibrant intellectual community that continued to grow beyond Italy's borders. The encouragement to younger scientists became my quiet rebellion. When a young mathematician in France wrote seeking advice on projectile motion, I spent weeks drafting a response that carefully explained the parabolic path of falling objects without mentioning the astronomical implications. When an English thinker inquired about improving telescope lenses, I described the grinding techniques I had developed while avoiding any reference to what those lenses had revealed. Each letter was a balancing act, offering guidance while protecting both the recipient and myself from further trouble. The satisfaction came from knowing these seeds of knowledge would grow in freer soil. The careful wording required constant attention. I learned to write about hypothetical systems rather than physical realities, to discuss mathematical elegance rather than observed evidence. References to Copernicus became the Prussian mathematician, while Aristotle was the ancient philosopher. These linguistic dances felt demeaning at first, but I came to see them as necessary tactics in a larger war for truth. The important thing was that the ideas continued to circulate, that the method of observation and reason survived despite attempts to suppress it. The letters became vessels carrying precious cargo through dangerous waters. There was profound satisfaction in hearing how others were building on my work. A Dutch lens maker wrote describing improvements to telescope design that achieved even greater magnification. A German mathematician shared calculations confirming the orbital periods of Jupiter's moons with stunning precision. Each piece of news felt like watching children I had nurtured grow into adulthood. My confinement mattered less when I saw how the work continued through others, how truth found its way through cracks in the walls institutions built around it. The community of thinkers across Europe became my extended family, their progress my solace. The risk was always present, of course. Each letter carried potential danger for both writer and recipient. We developed subtle codes, references to the Medicean stars instead of Jupiter's moons, discussions of the second system rather than heliocentrism. Important messages were sometimes hidden in personal news or mathematical exercises. The constant awareness of surveillance created a strange intimacy in these correspondences, as if we were all whispering in a room full of listeners. Yet the need to communicate, to share ideas, to maintain the community of inquiry proved stronger than the fear of consequences. In the quiet of my study, with the world reduced to the sound of pen on paper, these letters became my conversation with the future. Each response I drafted, each problem I solved for a distant colleague, felt like placing another stone in a bridge that would carry knowledge across the gap between my time and what would come. The authorities could confine my body and restrict my movements, but they could not stop the quiet exchange of ideas that continued through these carefully worded messages. The truth was finding its way out, one letter at a time, and that knowledge brought me peace as the light faded from my eyes, but never from my mind. Maria Celeste became my eyes when mine began to fail, her letters arriving like clockwork every week. Written in that careful convent hand I could still barely make out if I held the page close enough. She never spoke of my trial or recantation directly, as if those painful events existed in some other world beyond the convent walls. Instead, she wrote about the olive harvest, the quality of the light through her window, the hymns they sang at vespers, ordinary beauty that reminded me there was still grace in the world. Her faith remained unshaken, seeing no conflict between my work and God's glory. The heavens declare the glory of God, she would write, and your telescope has simply helped us hear their declaration more clearly. Her practical support was as important as her spiritual comfort. She would send small packages, medicinal herbs from the convent garden, preserves she had made herself, a new blanket when winter approached. These simple gifts spoke of a love that needed no grand gestures, a connection that transcended walls and restrictions. I would save her letters to read last each day, drawing out the anticipation, knowing her words would bring a moment of peace before sleep. In her careful script, I found a world that remained whole and good, untouched by the controversies that had shattered my own. There was a painful symmetry to our situations, both confined, though her walls were chosen while mine were imposed. Her convent in Arcetri stood not far from my villa, yet the distance felt immense. She had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living a life of discipline and prayer. I lived under different vows: silence, restriction, and the obedience of denied truth. Yet in our correspondence we met as equals, sharing a world of thought and care that knew no physical boundaries. Her letters became my window to a simpler, kinder reality. When my eyesight failed completely, her role changed. She began describing the world for me. The way sunlight fell through my study window at different hours, the progress of flowers in the garden through the seasons, even the expressions on visitors' faces. Her observations were so precise and vivid that I could almost see through her eyes. She became my connection to the visual world I had lost, describing things with the same careful attention to detail that I had once applied to celestial observations. In this way, she gave me back a piece of what had been taken. Her own scientific curiosity surprised me. Though she never studied mathematics formally, she asked perceptive questions about my work, how pendulums kept time, why objects fell at the same rate regardless of weight. She saw the divine order in natural law, the beauty in mathematical regularity. God is the greatest mathematician, she wrote once, and I felt a surge of pride that she understood what so many learned men fail to grasp, that studying creation was an act of worship, not defiance. The grief when she passed before me was the deepest darkness I have known, deeper even than my blindness. The world narrowed further without her letters, without that weekly assurance that someone understood and cared. They allowed me to attend her funeral, guards standing discreetly at the back of the small chapel. As they lowered her into the earth, I thought of all she had given me, not just comfort and care, but the example of a faith that could embrace both tradition and truth. Her absence became a permanent silence in my life, a missing counterpart to the visual darkness that already surrounded me. The letters from abroad told a story my confinement could not silence. From France came word of Descartes, building upon my work with falling bodies, his mathematics giving form to the principles of motion I had observed. England wrote through Thomas Hobbes, who saw in my methods a new way to understand not just nature, but human society itself. Even in my isolation, I could feel the ideas spreading like roots beneath a wall, finding fertile ground in places where inquiry was not yet forbidden. Each piece of correspondence brought news of someone building upon the foundation I had laid, and this knowledge became my secret sustenance. The satisfaction of method prevailing over authority grew steadily during those confined years. Where I had been forced to recant, others now continued the work freely. The telescope, once viewed with suspicion, became a standard tool of inquiry across Europe. The mathematical methods I developed for measuring motion were being applied to new problems. The very approach I championed, observation followed by mathematical description, was becoming the new way of understanding the world. They could imprison the man, but they could not imprison the method, and that truth brought a quiet vindication that no tribunal could take away. The quiet knowledge that truth cannot be imprisoned forever became my anchor during the darkest days. I would sit in my garden, blind eyes turned toward the sky I could no longer see, and take comfort in the certainty that Jupiter's moons continued their orbits, that Venus still showed her phases, that the laws of motion operated with perfect consistency. These truths required no defense, no permission, no official approval. They simply were, and would continue to be long after all of us who debated them were dust. This was the ultimate victory, not being proven right, but knowing that truth itself is eternal. The foundation being laid for Newton's future work arrived in snippets of correspondence that I cherished like precious gems. A young mathematician at Cambridge was studying my laws of motion and beginning to think about universal gravitation. The pieces were falling into place. The same mathematics that described falling apples might describe the moon's orbit around Earth. I never saw Newton's work completed, of course, but the reports gave me hope that someone would eventually unite earthly and celestial mechanics into a single system. The thought that my work might contribute to such a synthesis made the years of confinement feel less like punishment and more like preparation. The distinction between scripture and nature as God's works remained clear in my mind despite everything that had happened. I never saw a true conflict between faith and science, only between human interpretations of scripture and human observations of nature. God had given us two books to read: the Bible, which reveals his will for our salvation, and the natural world, which reveals his glory through the magnificent order of creation. How could these two books possibly contradict each other when they came from the same divine author? The problem arose when people insisted on interpreting scripture literally in matters that were meant to be understood through observation and reason. My belief that truth cannot contradict truth sustained me through the darkest moments of my trial and confinement. If my observations showed the earth moved around the sun, and if scripture seemed to say otherwise, then the error must lie in our understanding of scripture, not in God's creation. The Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. This distinction, which I argued repeatedly in my writings, was never meant as disrespect for religion, but as respect for the different ways God communicates with humanity. The stars themselves declare God's glory, and my telescope was simply helping us hear that declaration more clearly. The sadness I felt was not for the church as an institution, but for the fear that seemed to grip those in authority. Why should new understanding be seen as threat rather than celebration? Each discovery about the universe reveals more of God's infinite wisdom and creativity. The ordered motions of the planets, the mathematical precision of their orbits, the incredible scale of creation, all of this points to a creator far more magnificent than the limited universe described by ancient cosmology. I never understood why exploring God's works could be considered anything other than an act of worship. My enduring faith in both God and reason became the foundation upon which I rebuilt my life after the trial. Confined to my villa, blind and isolated, I continued to find comfort in prayer and in the quiet work of mathematics. The same God who inspired the scriptures also created the laws of motion that governed the falling apple and the orbiting moon. This harmony between faith and reason was my quiet certainty, a truth that no tribunal could overturn. They could force me to deny what I had seen with my eyes, but they could not force me to abandon the method of seeking truth that I believed was God's gift to humanity. The tragedy was that institutions entrusted with preserving truth often become afraid of new discoveries. They confuse the preservation of tradition with the protection of truth itself. But truth is not a fragile thing that needs protection. It is robust and resilient, able to withstand examination and questioning. The real threat to faith comes not from new knowledge, but from insisting on outdated understandings that eventually make religion appear foolish. I served God best by being honest about what his creation revealed, even when that honesty came at great personal cost. In my quiet moments, I often thought about the relationship between humility and inquiry. True humility means recognizing the limits of our understanding, being willing to question our assumptions, and admitting when evidence contradicts what we thought we knew. This kind of humility actually strengthens faith by preventing it from becoming rigid and brittle. The God I worship is not threatened by human discovery. He invites it. The universe he created is meant to be explored, understood, and marveled at. Each new discovery is an invitation to worship more intelligently, more deeply, with greater awe at the magnificence of creation. The distinction I tried to make between different kinds of truth was perhaps the most important contribution of my life, even more than the astronomical discoveries themselves. There are truths of faith that we accept through revelation, and truths of nature that we discover through observation and reason. These two paths to truth should complement each other, not conflict. When they seem to disagree, the problem is with our limited human understanding, not with God's consistent truth. This perspective allows both faith and science to flourish, each in its proper domain, each enriching our understanding of God's relationship with His creation. My hope, even now, is that future generations will learn from my struggle, that they will understand that questioning and faith are not enemies, but partners in the search for truth, that religious authorities will encourage the study of God's works as enthusiastically as they teach about God's Word, and that scientists will approach their work with a humility and wonder that recognizes every discovery as a glimpse into the mind of the Creator. The universe is too magnificent to be contained by any single interpretation, and God is too great to be limited by our incomplete understanding. There is a profound difference between being told something and discovering it for yourself, between accepting authority and understanding through evidence. For most of my life, I had been told that heavy objects fall faster than light ones, that the heavens are perfect and unchanging, that Earth stands motionless at the centre of creation. These were not truths that had been discovered through inquiry, but truths that had been declared by tradition. The weight of authority pressed down on every question, every curiosity, until I learned to trust what I could measure rather than what I had been taught. The weight of evidence carries a certainty that the weight of tradition cannot match. When I dropped those two weights from the leaning tower and heard them strike the ground together, that single sound carried more truth than all the volumes of Aristotle in the university library. When I saw Jupiter's moons circling another world, when I watched Venus move through her phases, these observations settled in my soul with a finality that no argument could shake. Truth discovered through observation has a different quality than truth received through teaching. It becomes part of you, woven into your understanding of how the world actually works. The personal cost of seeing differently is something few understand until they must pay it. It begins with small things, the raised eyebrows when you question accepted wisdom, the coolness from colleagues who prefer comfortable tradition to uncomfortable truth. Then come the direct challenges, the accusations of arrogance, the suggestion that you think yourself wiser than generations of learned men. Finally, if the truth you've discovered challenges powerful institutions, comes the real price. Isolation, condemnation, the choice between what you know and what you're allowed to say. This cost is paid not in money or time, but in pieces of your standing, your security, your peace. Yet the quiet certainty that persists despite opposition makes the cost bearable. Even when forced to recant, even when confined to my villa, even when going blind from years of observation, the knowledge remained. The stars continued their motions regardless of human declarations. The mathematics continued to describe reality regardless of official prohibitions. Truth has a way of enduring long after its discoverers are gone, and that thought brought me peace as I watched the world continue its motions without me. What we discover through evidence becomes part of the world's permanent understanding, even if it must wait generations for acceptance. What I lost was measured in tangible things, the freedom to walk beyond my garden walls, the reputation I had built over a lifetime of work, the very eyesight that had first revealed these wonders to me. The world narrowed to the dimensions of my villa, my movements watched, my correspondence monitored. The man who had been celebrated across Europe now lived in quiet isolation, his name associated with heresy rather than discovery. The instruments that had been my pride gathered dust as my vision failed, until even the familiar stars became blurred points of light I could no longer clearly see. These losses were real, and they ached in the quiet hours of the night. What I gained was less tangible, but more enduring, the certainty that comes from seeing truth directly, the legacy of a method that would outlive any individual, the peace that comes from having followed evidence wherever it led, the satisfaction of watching others build upon my work, of knowing the ideas would continue to spread despite attempts to suppress them. These became my private victories. The cost was high, but the gain was permanent. Truth, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered, and that knowledge sustained me through the long years of confinement and fading sight. The choice I would make again, despite the cost, is not a statement of bravery, but of necessity. When truth reveals itself to you, when evidence accumulates with such clarity and consistency, you have no real choice but to accept it. The alternative, denying what you know to be true, costs far more than any external punishment. The loss of integrity, the betrayal of your own mind, the living of a lie, these are prices too high for any man to pay. So yes, I would choose truth again, because the alternative was never truly a choice at all. The understanding that progress demands sacrifice came slowly, through the accumulation of small losses that eventually revealed a larger pattern. Every advance in human understanding has required someone to see differently, to question what others accept, to bear the cost of being first. This is not because truth is hostile, but because human institutions become attached to particular understandings and fear the disruption of change. The sacrifice is not in the discovery itself, but in the bridging of the gap between what is known and what is accepted. Someone must stand in that gap, and that standing always comes at a personal cost. The reports arrived like whispers from a world I could no longer fully participate in. Each letter, a window to developments I could only imagine from my confinement. Through carefully worded correspondence and visits from trusted colleagues, I learned of telescopes being improved in Holland, of mathematics evolving in France, of new observations confirming what I had seen decades earlier. The work continued without me, the ideas spreading across Europe like seeds carried by an unstoppable wind. There was both comfort and melancholy in knowing that the pursuit of truth needed no single person, not even the one who had first seen these things clearly. The satisfaction of being proven right by time arrived quietly, without fanfare or official recognition. Younger astronomers wrote of confirming Jupiter's satellite periods with greater precision, of observing lunar librations that explained why we sometimes see slightly more than half the moon's surface, of mathematical refinements to the laws of motion I had proposed. None of these letters said, "You were right," but the evidence spoke for itself. The universe continued to operate as I had described it, regardless of what any tribunal had declared. This quiet vindication was sweeter than any public acclaim could have been, because it came from reality itself rather than human opinion. The bittersweet nature of this vindication after punishment was perhaps the most complex emotion of my later years. To know you were right but prevented from saying so, to see others advance the work you began but cannot continue yourself, to watch the world slowly accept what you were punished for proposing. These are feelings that have no simple name. It was like watching a play from behind a curtain, seeing the story unfold exactly as you knew it would, but being unable to step on stage or speak your lines. The truth prevailed, but I could only witness its progress from the shadows of my confinement. The knowledge that my work would outlive my oppressors became my quiet consolation. The cardinals who sat in judgment, the theologians who declared heliocentrism heretical, the officials who enforced my confinement, they would all be remembered, if at all, as obstacles to understanding. Meanwhile, the discoveries would continue to light the way for future generations. There is a peculiar justice in how truth eventually settles these accounts, not through revenge or retaliation, but through the simple, relentless accumulation of evidence that cannot be denied forever. The stars themselves became the final arbiters, and their silent testimony would continue long after all our names were forgotten. The slowing came gradually, like a river easing toward the sea. My body, which had carried me through 68 years of observation and argument, began to settle into its final rhythms. The arthritis that had plagued my hands for decades now seemed to spread through my entire being, each movement requiring more consideration, more effort. Mornings found me sitting by the window, not with papers and instruments as before, but simply watching the light change across the garden I could no longer clearly see. The world had narrowed to the sound of bird song, the scent of ripening fruit from the orchard, the texture of the wool blanket across my knees. There was a strange peace in this gradual release from striving, in accepting the natural conclusion of a life fully lived. The work was complete as any man's work can be. The 2 new sciences had been published, my final thoughts on motion and mechanics safely delivered to the wider world through trusted hands. The correspondence had slowed to a trickle, then ceased altogether as my responses grew less frequent, less coherent. The ideas were out there now, travelling through Europe, being tested and refined by younger minds. My role had shifted from active participant to quiet observer, from contributor to ancestor. There was satisfaction in this completion, in knowing I had given what I could to the great conversation of human understanding. The peace came not from victory or vindication, but from having remained true to the method itself. I had followed observation where it led, trusted mathematics to reveal patterns, respected evidence over authority. Even when forced to deny specific conclusions, I had never abandoned the approach itself. This consistency with my own principles became my final comfort. The specific discoveries might be debated, the conclusions contested, but the method of careful observation and mathematical reasoning would endure. I had stayed faithful to that method, and that faithfulness brought a quiet assurance that transcended any particular finding. The hope for future understanding became my final meditation. As the light faded from my eyes and the strength from my body, I found myself thinking not of what I had accomplished, but of what would come after. The telescope would be improved, the mathematics refined, the observations extended to realms I could not imagine. Someone would eventually unite earthly and celestial mechanics into a single system. Someone would understand the nature of light itself. The work I had begun would continue through others, and that continuity felt like a kind of immortality. The truth would not be completed in my lifetime, but it would be advanced, and that was enough. The year 1642 arrived quietly, marked more by the increasing heaviness in my limbs than by any celebration. The world had grown softer at its edges, the sounds more distant, the passage of time measured in small routines rather than grand events. I would sit for hours in my garden, the winter sun weak on my face, thinking of all the years that had brought me to this quiet conclusion. There was poetry in the timing that I could appreciate, even as my own light faded. The same year that would close my life would open another's, a handoff of the scientific torch I would never see but felt certain was coming. Through the careful correspondence that still reached me despite my isolation, I heard whispers of a brilliant young mind at Cambridge, Isaac Newton, born that same year, who would never know the world as I had known it. He would grow up in a universe already transformed by the discoveries we had fought to establish, where mathematics and observation were no longer heresy but honoured methods of inquiry. The ideas that had cost me so much would be his starting point, the foundation upon which he would build understandings I could only glimpse in my clearest moments. There was comfort in this continuity, this assurance that truth moves forward even when individuals fall away. The unconscious passing of the torch happened without ceremony or recognition, as most important transitions do. I knew nothing of this Newton child, of course, just as he would know me only through my work, not my struggles. Yet the connection felt real. The same year closing one chapter of understanding and opening another. My life had been about questioning Aristotle's physics. His would be about establishing new physics that could explain both earthly and celestial motion. Where I had shown that objects fall at the same rate regardless of weight, he would discover why they fall at all. The pieces were connecting across time and distance, and I felt privileged to have placed a few of them in position. The continuity of scientific pursuit became my final comfort as the days grew shorter. The work was never about any single person, not me, not Copernicus, not this Newton yet unborn. It was about the slow, patient accumulation of understanding, each generation standing on the shoulders of the previous one, seeing a little further into the magnificent complexity of God's creation. My confinement, my blindness, even my recantation, these were temporary obstacles in a journey that would continue long after I was gone. The stars would keep their motions and curious minds would keep seeking to understand them, and that was enough. The proper role of institutions in seeking truth should be that of a guide, not a jailer. When those in power become more concerned with protecting their interpretations than with understanding reality, they betray the very truth they claim to serve. I learned this through difficult experience, that authority can become its own kind of idol, worshipped for its own sake rather than for the truth it was meant to protect. The tragedy is not that institutions exist, but that they sometimes forget their purpose is to serve truth, not to control it. The danger of certainty without questioning is perhaps the greatest threat to genuine understanding. When we become so sure of our answers that we stop asking questions, we cease to truly learn. The universe is far more complex and wonderful than any single interpretation can contain. The humility to admit I might be wrong is not weakness, but wisdom. It opens the door to deeper understanding. Those who claim absolute certainty about matters that require ongoing investigation often fear the disruption of new knowledge more than they love truth itself. The need for humility exists in both science and faith, though it manifests differently. In science, humility means being willing to follow evidence where it leads, even when it contradicts our favourite theories. In faith, humility means recognizing that our understanding of God is always partial, always filtered through human limitation. Both require the courage to say, "I don't know," when faced with mystery. The greatest minds I've known, in both theology and natural philosophy, shared this quality of humble curiosity, this recognition that the more we understand, the more we realize how much remains beyond our comprehension. The lesson that power cannot ultimately suppress evidence has been written across my life in ways both painful and reassuring. They could force me to recant, they could confine me to my home, they could restrict my work, but they could not make Jupiter's moons stop orbiting, could not prevent Venus from showing her phases, could not change the mathematics that so beautifully describes falling objects. Truth has a stubborn persistence that outlasts any human attempt to control it. The stars continue their motions regardless of our declarations about them, and that fact alone should teach us humility about our own importance in the grand scheme of things. The isolation of seeing what others denied became my constant companion during those long years at our set tree. There is a particular loneliness that comes from knowing something true that the world insists is false. I would sit in my garden, blind eyes turned toward where I knew Jupiter to be, and feel the distance between my understanding and everyone else's. The stars themselves became my only confidants. Their silent motions are language only I seem to understand. That space between knowledge and acceptance is where I lived for decades, close enough to touch the truth, but too far for others to hear me describe it. The loneliness of being right too soon is a peculiar kind of suffering. It's not the loneliness of being wrong, where at least you have company and error. It's the isolation of seeing the puzzle solved while others still struggle with the pieces. When I watched Venus complete her phases, when I calculated the orbits of Jupiter's moons, the patterns were so clear, so beautiful in their mathematical precision. Yet when I tried to share this vision, I met blank stares or outright hostility. The truth was there for anyone to see through my telescope, but few were willing to look, and fewer still to believe what they saw. The comfort of the stars that remained true became my anchor in this isolation. While human institutions wavered and human opinions shifted, the heavens continued their silent, majestic dance, according to laws that never varied. Jupiter's moons kept their precise orbits, whether the Inquisition approved or not. Venus showed her phases regardless of what any council declared. This constancy reminded me that truth exists independently of our recognition of it. The universe does not need our permission to be what it is, and that thought brought a profound comfort during my most lonely moments. The peace of having followed evidence wherever it led arrived gradually, like dawn after a long night. It came not from victory or vindication, but from the quiet assurance that I had been faithful to the method of inquiry itself. Even when forced to deny specific conclusions, I had never abandoned the approach of observation, measurement, and mathematical reasoning. This internal consistency became my true compass, more reliable than any external approval or condemnation. The cost had been high: freedom, reputation, eyesight. But the peace of knowing I had remained true to evidence made the cost bearable in the end. Why do we fear new understandings so deeply? Is it the uncertainty they bring? The way they ask us to rearrange the furniture of our minds? I've wondered this many nights, listening to the objections not just to my work, but to any idea that challenges what's comfortable and known. The fear isn't really about stars or planets. It's about what changes in ourselves when we admit we might have been wrong. That vulnerability, that moment when the ground shifts beneath your feet, that's what truly frightens people. Not the movement of Earth, but the movement of understanding. How do institutions balance tradition and progress? This was the great tension of my life, watching the church struggle with new wine in old wineskins. The desire to protect truth is noble, but when protection becomes preservation of the status quo, something vital is lost. Institutions should be gardens where truth grows, not museums where it's displayed under glass. The balance comes from remembering that tradition should guide us forward, not chain us to the past. The strongest traditions are those that can absorb new light without breaking. What truth costs those who first speak it is something I understand intimately. The price isn't paid in grand gestures, but in small daily moments. The friend who stops visiting, the colleague who looks away, the quiet that falls when you enter a room. It's in the letters that stop coming, the invitations that never arrive, the way your name is spoken in hushed tones. This cost is paid in the currency of human connection, and it's a debt that compounds with time. Yet the alternative, silence when you should speak, costs something far more precious: your own integrity. Why do the stars continue to call us to look upward? I've thought about this often, especially since losing my sight. There's something in us that needs to reach beyond ourselves, to connect with something larger and more enduring. The stars represent that eternal curiosity, that need to understand our place in the cosmos. They remind us that we're part of a story much larger than our individual lives, and that looking up is an act of hope, a belief that there are answers to be found if we're brave enough to keep asking questions. The telescope was never just a tool to me. It was an extension of human curiosity itself, a way to reach beyond our earthly limitations and touch the heavens with our questions. I remember the first time I understood its true power wasn't in magnification, but in revelation. Those nights spent grinding lenses until my fingers ached, the careful alignment of glass that would become windows to truths hidden for centuries. The instrument became my companion in discovery, but more importantly it became proof that we could extend our senses beyond what nature had given us. That simple tube with two pieces of glass revolutionized not just astronomy, but the very idea of how we might come to know the world. The method of experiment over authority became my quiet rebellion against centuries of accepted wisdom. Where others looked to ancient texts for answers, I looked to falling stones and rolling balls. Where they quoted Aristotle, I measured time with my own pulse. This shift, from deference to observation, felt like waking from a long sleep. Suddenly, the world was full of questions waiting to be asked, problems waiting to be solved through careful looking and measuring. The beauty was that anyone could do it. You didn't need special permission or ancient wisdom, just willingness to look carefully and think clearly about what you saw. The courage to trust measurement over doctrine didn't feel courageous at the time. It felt like simple honesty. When those two different weights struck the ground together, the evidence was there in that single sound. When Venus showed her phases, the pattern was clear in my careful sketches night after night. The courage came later, when I had to choose between what I had measured and what I was told to believe. That's when I understood that truth often requires not just intelligence, but character. The willingness to trust your own eyes even when others insist you're seeing wrong. The enduring power of simple, careful observation remains the greatest lesson of my life. You don't need complex instruments or special training to notice how ships disappear over the horizon, or how a pendulum keeps time, or how shadows change with the seasons. The world is full of evidence waiting for someone to look closely. That's the legacy I hope endures, not my specific discoveries but the method itself. The courage to look, the patience to measure, the humility to follow evidence where it leads. These simple practices have power to reveal truths far beyond what any single authority could ever teach us. The same stars I studied night after night still shine above you now, unchanged by all our human debates and declarations. They continue their silent motions according to laws that need no permission from popes or philosophers. When you look up at Jupiter on a clear evening, those 4 moons still circle it in their perfect orbits, just as they did when I first documented their movements over 400 nights. Venus still shows her phases, the moon still reveals its mountains and valleys, the Milky Way still stretches across the sky as a river of countless suns. The truth I saw through my telescope remains written in the heavens, waiting for anyone willing to look with open eyes and an open mind. The same questions that tugged at my curiosity still await answers in your time. Why do the planets move as they do? What forces govern their motions? How vast is this creation we inhabit? These are not questions that belong to any century or any person. They are human questions, born from that spark of wonder that makes us look upward and wonder about our place in the cosmos. The tools may have improved, the mathematics refined, but the essential mystery remains. We are small creatures on a small world, trying to understand a universe of magnificent scale and complexity. That humility in the face of mystery is where true inquiry begins. The same courage I needed then is still required to see clearly now. It takes courage to question accepted wisdom, to trust evidence over tradition, to speak truths that might inconvenience powerful institutions. This courage looks different in every age. For me, it meant facing the Inquisition. For you, it might mean challenging popular misconceptions or resisting the pressure to conform to fashionable errors. But the essential choice remains. Will you believe what you're told, or will you trust what you can observe and verify for yourself? That choice determines whether understanding moves forward or stands still. The same truth that could not be imprisoned then cannot be contained now. They confined my body to a small villa, restricted my movements, monitored my correspondence, but they could not stop the ideas from spreading. Truth has a way of finding cracks in the walls we build around it, seeping through correspondence and conversation, crossing borders and generations. The same will be true in your time. No amount of censorship, no force of authority, no weight of tradition can ultimately suppress what is real. The universe operates by its own rules, and those rules will eventually make themselves known to anyone willing to observe carefully and think clearly. What is it that makes us look upward and wonder? That spark of curiosity is the most human thing about us. The need to understand, to know our place in this vast creation. I've spent my life following that spark, even when it led me into conflict with powerful institutions. The freedom to question is not rebellion. It's obedience to the way God made us. We're meant to wonder, to explore, to seek understanding. The true heresy is not asking difficult questions, but refusing to ask any questions at all. The danger comes when answers become so rigid they cannot be questioned. I learned this through painful experience, that certainty without curiosity becomes its own kind of prison. When we stop asking why and how, when we accept explanations because they're traditional rather than true, we betray the very intellect God gave us. The universe is too magnificent, too complex to be contained by any single interpretation. The stars themselves invite our questions with their silent, constant motion. The beauty of mystery is that it invites investigation rather than shutting it down. Every answer I found through my telescope only revealed deeper questions, more complex patterns waiting to be understood. This is how God's creation works. It reveals itself gradually to those willing to look carefully and think humbly. The mystery is not a wall to stop our inquiry, but a door that opens to deeper understanding when we approach with respect and curiosity. The hope that curiosity will always survive fear is what sustained me through the darkest days. They could restrict my movements, monitor my correspondence, even take my eyesight, but they could not extinguish that spark of wonder that makes us human. As long as people look up at the stars and feel that tug of curiosity, as long as they ask, what if, and why not, truth will continue to reveal itself. The freedom to question is the most essential freedom of all, because without it, all other freedoms eventually wither. There is a particular peace that comes when the work is done and the fighting is over. Sitting here in my garden at Arcetri, the same stars I spent a lifetime studying still shine above me, though I can no longer see them clearly. Their light reaches me only as faint blurs now, but their positions and motions remain sharp in my memory, a celestial map etched permanently in my mind. I know exactly where Jupiter should be tonight, what phase Venus shows, how the moons I discovered continue their silent dance around that distant world. This knowledge has become my private comfort, a truth no tribunal could take from me. The satisfaction comes not from being proven right, but from having asked the questions well. Each observation, each calculation, each night spent at my telescope was a conversation with creation itself, an attempt to understand the magnificent order God built into the universe. They could force me to deny my conclusions, but they could never force me to regret the process of discovery. The true value was never in being right, but in pursuing truth with integrity, following evidence wherever it led, respecting the method above any particular result. My hope for those who come after is that they will continue looking upward with that same mixture of humility and courage. The stars have so much more to teach us, patterns we haven't yet noticed, relationships we haven't yet understood, mysteries that will only reveal themselves to patient observers. The work I began is barely a beginning, a first glimpse at truths that will unfold over centuries. What matters is that the looking continues, that the questions keep being asked, that we never become so certain of our answers that we stop wondering. The knowledge that the truth was worth every cost has settled deep in my soul. They took my freedom, my reputation, even my eyesight, but they could not take the quiet certainty that comes from having seen clearly. When you know something true, not because you were told, but because you observed and measured and verified, that knowledge becomes part of you in a way that external circumstances cannot touch. The stars will continue their motions, and curious minds will continue seeking to understand them, and that continuity makes every sacrifice meaningful. The stars continue their silent motion, unchanged by our understanding or declarations. They have witnessed all our human struggles, and will continue their dance long after our names are forgotten. What remains is the choice we each must make when truth reveals itself to us. Will we have the courage to see clearly, even when seeing differently comes at great cost? My name is Galileo Galilei, and despite everything they took from me, I would choose truth again. Would you do the same?